Well, let's get started together. I thought tonight we would do something a little bit different. I'd like to read through the text together. I'll read it out loud. And I'd like to then have a little, maybe 10 minutes or so, where each of us can take some time to notice some things in the text and make some observations. This is John chapter 5, and in it, Jesus again is confronting in a major way the world of the Pharisees. This time he's tackled the sort of beating heart of their religion, which is the Sabbath, and practicing not only ritual purity, but everything that they believe that Jewish people are supposed to do on the Sabbath. This is still a huge question in Judaism. Our refrigerator has a Sabbath setting. I don't know if your refrigerator does or not, but ours does. The reason is that in highly Orthodox circles in Judaism, you are not supposed to light fire on the Sabbath, and so by connection, some of the rabbis have decided that that means you shouldn't turn on electric lights or push elevator buttons. If you've ever been in New York on a Saturday, a Friday night through Saturday night, there are elevators in some of the hotels that are running constantly because they're on Sabbath settings. So anyway, this Sabbath is a big deal still. And when you have Jewish friends and you see them Friday evening, you can greet them with Shabbat Shalom. And if you're good friends, they might invite you to come to synagogue with them. We have some family stories about that, but I won't go through those right now. But if friends that have invited us to synagogue. But I'd like us to look at John chapter 5 because, as I said, Jesus is really confronting, again, the worldview of the Pharisees. And he's doing it not only in religious terms. He's not just having a disagreement with them about how to practice Shabbat, but he's going to the real heart of the thing and saying that he has, in essence, he's claiming authority to decide what Shabbat really means. And who he is comes out very clearly in this. They recognize where it's headed, and they really don't like it. So it's all centered around the term work or works in John chapter 5. And that's what I'd like us to kind of look at when we go through this. I'd like you to, if you have a pen or pencil, I know they're probably only available in antique stores anymore, but if you have one, then you can, as we go through, you might just circle the word works or working as I read through, and then just underline the word do, does, or doing. Those are the key words that outline what Jesus is teaching here about himself and about his view of his relationship to God the Father. And then after we do that, then we can kind of each take a little bit of time and ask, what does the Father do? There's some very clear statements here. And what are his works? And what does the Son do? What are his works? So without further ado, let's look at the text. I'll read through it. And if you sharpen your pencil with works or working and related words, to circle them and to underline the word do, does, or doing. It'll come a little bit later in the text, but and just underline them. Then we can use this as kind of a basis for our conversation tonight. So it starts out with a description of a healing that Jesus does. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who'd been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water's stirred up, and while I'm going down, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is this man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who'd been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you're well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father's working until now, and I'm working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So Jesus replied to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but is passed from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming, and now is here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he's granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he's given him authority to execute judgment because he's the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out. Those who've done good to the resurrection of life, and those who've done evil to the resurrection of judgment. I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. There's another who bears witness about me, and I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true. You sent to John, and he's borne witness to the truth. Not that the testimony that I receive is from man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. He was a burning and shining lamp, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. But the testimony that I have is greater than that of John, for the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I'm doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you've heard, you never heard. His form you have never seen, and you do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe the one whom he sent. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. And it's they that bear witness about me, yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. I don't receive glory from people, but I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I've come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and don't seek the glory that comes from the only God? Don't think that I'll accuse you to the Father. There's one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you've set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you don't believe his writings, how will you believe my words? As you notice, there's a lot of references to work and works here, and also do and doing. So what I'd like us to do now is just take about 5 or 10 minutes, probably closer to 10 minutes, and I'd like to have each of us just kind of review what we just read and underlined or circled, and ask, what does the Father do? What are his works that Jesus outlines here? And what does the Son do? What are his works? And then we'll take a close look at the text together. So I'll put the recording on pause right now, and we'll take about 10 minutes each. So I know there's not been enough time to finish this, but I thought we could kind of work on it some together, but at least it's kind of gotten you into the pool, and you can work on it probably some this coming week if you'd like. But let's just kind of talk together, see if we can sort of identify these places where the words work and working and do and doing come up. Where's the first place that you noticed these words work and working? What verse was that in? 17, yeah. Jesus answered them. He was replying to the Pharisees who were criticizing him for doing this healing on the Sabbath. And he says, my Father's working until now, and I am working. Okay? Next place where you noticed works or working. Verse 20, the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these he will show him, so that you may marvel. And then there's kind of a long stretch on work and works until verse 36. And it says, the works the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I'm doing bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. So this idea of God's work and the work that he's given to Jesus are really closely tied together here in the passage. And for us, that's interesting, obviously, but it isn't as provocative as it was to the Pharisees. Let's start with a story, and then we'll lead into why this was such a provocative confrontation with the Pharisees. It opens up with this story about the healing at the pool of Bethesda. It mentions at the beginning that it was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. It's not necessarily the Passover. We don't know which feast it was. It could be any one of a number of feasts during the active years of Jesus' ministry. You see, it's ambiguous. It says after this. Again, he's not being really particular about when it was. He explains it does explain why the story that follows takes place in Jerusalem. Jesus had been in Galilee, and we've noticed before that the author of the book of John isn't particularly worried about moving things forward. For example, the cleansing of the temple, much like perhaps a filmmaker would move an incident that was really important forward in the film and emphasize the reasons that Jesus was in confrontation with the religious leaders. So the main focus here seems to be on another issue. So what was the issue? As I mentioned, in John chapter 5, Jesus confronts another, in fact, the major religious tradition of the Pharisees, namely the Sabbath. And it becomes a huge center of controversy. As I mentioned, keeping of the Sabbath was and is the beating heart of religion for the Pharisees. They were massively concerned about how you properly observe Shabbat. I mentioned before that Some of the rabbis taught that if all Israel would keep Shabbat properly on one Sabbath, that Messiah would come. And so Jesus visits the pool at Bethesda on the Sabbath, and it says that what was going on there was something that would ultimately result in more conflict with the Pharisees and with his death. So, John chapter 5, verse 2 sets the scene. It's a location outside. It's not in a synagogue. There is in Jerusalem, it says, by the sheep gate, a pool. The word gate is not in the original language, and it probably is referring to a sheep area or a sheep pond, that there was this sort of bathhouse arrangement there. And it would account for this reference in John's Gospel to 5 different porticos or colonnades. The way this would work and look is probably something like, you can imagine a square. Those are 4 colonnades. And then across the middle is a 5th one. And the colonnade in the middle, there were pillars, probably divided the pool for the men and the pool for the women. So it was kind of an open bath place where people could do ritual washings and things. And for the longest time, critics of the scripture, 150 years long, said that this was an imaginary image, that there wasn't anything like this in Jerusalem, and it was just a story that was dreamed up much later, sort of idealizing Jerusalem and the life of Jesus. They considered it to be a purely fictional invention of the author. And then 2 things happened. One was a document was discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, near the Dead Sea, the community that had written these texts of Scripture as well as their own documents. And in one of the scrolls, the so-called copper scroll, the pool of Bethesda is mentioned also. And the word there is also in the Hebrew. In Hebrew, there's a case called dual, and it means double, and of course, and so it implies that there were actually twin pools which would fit with the 5 colonnades as I described. Well then, in addition to that though, a few years later, there was an actual discovery, an archaeological dig in Jerusalem near St. Anne's Monastery, and they discovered this thing. And it was huge. It wasn't just kind of a little pool the size of this room, but it was huge. It was as large as perhaps it was as large as perhaps a football field, with a dividing section of colonnades down the middle, as I said, probably to divide the men and the women's pools. It was probably built by King Herod, the puppet king of the Romans who tried to kill Jesus when he was an infant. And we read in verse 3, in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. The text that follows in verses 3 and 4, which I didn't read because they're not in the best manuscripts of the New Testament, offer a traditional explanation of why these people were there. It comes up again in something that the lame man himself says, but it was probably an explanation of a traditional reason why these people were there. There was a superstition that angels would come and stir the waters, and the first person into the water would be healed. And this lame man had a problem in that he could never get there first. So Jesus visits this location in verse 5, and it says, one man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew he'd already been there a long time, he said to him, fascinating question, do you want to be healed? We've just read the text. Why would Jesus ask a question like that? What could we imagine? Why he would be asking this man who'd been there 38 years, apparently trying to get into the water or be healed. And Jesus asks him, do you want to be healed? What kind of reasons could Jesus have had for that question? Any ideas, speculations, thoughts?
Because he knows the future. He knows what his response is going to be. And his response is, I think what he's saying, do you really want to be healed? Because the first thing the guy does is make an excuse.
Right.
Do you really want to be healed?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like for us, for me anyways,
Do we really want what we ask for sometimes?
And I want to be healed to a point.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Good observation. Any other thoughts?
I think it kind of falls in line with Jesus' overall character,
Okay.
where he doesn't foist himself on us or anybody. It's always an invitation.
It's an invitation. Okay. Good observation. Yeah.
That's a constant invitation.
Yeah.
We don't even.
Indeed. And in addition,
Maybe this man earns a living now, and he's 38 years old, and suddenly he's healed. What's his profession going to be?
yeah,
How's he going to make money?
he may well have been a
Who will feed him?
professional beggar, right? We know that those folk.
We know that Amos was a big baker, and that's Lois. Or did you already say Lois?
No, that's good. So he explains then, the man looks at Jesus, and the man, as you pointed out, Dale, says, I don't have any way to get in the water, so I can't be healed. And he then makes his case for alms, probably from Jesus, and Jesus said, get up, take up your bed and walk. And then verse 9 shows the effect of Jesus' words. It says, immediately, at once, the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. It was probably a sleeping mat made out of rushes, and he rolled it up and walked with it. And then in verse 9, up till this point, we've just been reading along or listening along if we were part of the original audience of the Gospel of John. There's this giant flash reveal, and he drops this bombshell, and he says, now that day was the Sabbath. Now, we've noticed before in chapters 1 through 4, we don't have the same reaction always to these things. They're just kind of, we read it and think, oh, okay, this was Sabbath. But that was kind of a wow. All right, this complicates things considerably. This makes this story not just a story of a healing, but this is setting up a major confrontation. A Jewish reader, or here in John's day, would probably have thought, whoa. And then immediately the problems begin. The Pharisees say to the man who had been healed, it's the Sabbath, it's not lawful for you to take up your bed. We already mentioned how important the Sabbath is in the piety and devotion of the Pharisees. And this man here is carrying his sleeping mat on the Sabbath, which they interpreted as not a thing that was allowed by the law. And he defends his actions to the rabbis by saying, the man who healed me, that man said, take up your bed and walk. Do you detect an avoidance of responsibility there? He just kind of slides to the side. And the religious leaders ask him in verse 12, who's the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? The phrase isn't particularly polite in the original language. It's kind of like, who's the guy that said to you, take up your bed and walk? It's not just who is the man, but it's kind of, who was this guy that said to you, take up your bed and walk, or mat and walk? And explains the man who had been healed didn't know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn. There was a large crowd in the place. Later, though, Jesus finds the man, interestingly enough, in the temple, which was pretty close to the pool of Bethesda. It was visited there. It was probably a place where a lot of beggars were, lame people and others blind and people like that, because It was a place that pilgrims to the temple would visit and then probably give alms to the beggars there. And so Jesus finds him in the temple. And he says to him in verse 14, "Look, you're well. Sin no more," actually means stop sinning, this change right here, "or something worse may happen to you." And the man was immediately faced with a choice, wasn't he? At that point, he's either going to be loyal to the one who healed him, or he's going to try to cover his bridges with the religious authorities who confronted him. Do you sense that tension this man is in of choice again? It's this choice that he's facing. In John chapter 3, verse 19, we read that people love darkness rather than light because our deeds are evil. And this man was faced with a choice. The man who was healed chose the darkness, and he even went on to betray Jesus. It says that he went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. Now, we've talked a couple times over the last few weeks about kind of a framework of thinking when we read the Gospel of John that I'd like to underline again and point out. Tonight we have a whiteboard here, and I kind of drew it on there. This is not an egg. It's my attempt to kind of show the relationship between what I've called the story or text world and the audience world. As we go on during our time together, we'll talk more about this, but as I share it, I think that the Gospel of John, out of the study I've done, was written as the last of the Gospels, probably by the one surviving apostle or member of the apostolic band, and it probably was in the 90s, which he would have been an old man at the end of his life and ministry. And during that time, there were major issues coming up. The Romans had destroyed the temple in 70 AD. The city of Jerusalem had been laid waste, and the Jewish people were dispersed, many of them as slaves, into captivity. And if I'm right, that the Gospel of John was written around the area which we now know as Ephesus and Asia Minor, modern Turkey. The book of Revelation talks about the 7 churches in that area that are along the Roman postal road in chapters 1 through 3 of the book of Revelation. Then the interesting thing, and I find this a fascinating question to ask, we can never be absolutely sure, but if you think about the audience world that this apostle, this man was writing to, or the source of the gospel, was his teaching for the young Christian groups that were still, many of them, anchored in synagogues. They were Jewish people, or they were Greeks that had been attending the synagogue, but they were also part of Jesus communities, and they were facing persecution. They were being pushed out of the synagogues. That's the audience world that the apostle was writing to. And so as we look at this, we began to see that the issues that are highlighted in the story or the text are issues that also relate to the world of the people that he was ministering to, what I've called here the audience world. And it's kind of really interesting as you read through the Gospel of John to notice this dynamic. It's kind of like asking, why did he include that story? I mean, there were many, many stories. In fact, the end of the Gospel of John says the world couldn't contain all the books that would describe the works of Jesus and the stories about him. Typical Jewish hyperbole, but nevertheless, it's true that there was a lot he could have said. Why did he tell these stories? And I think if we have in the back of our mind some of the hints that are given in the text, we can understand he was trying to help those that he was ministering to, those that he was concerned about, the people that were his circle of disciples and the young small churches, the Christian communities that were gathered around that area. And so he picked these stories not just kind of like randomly, not like Antique Roadshow or something like that, but he actually chose them for a reason, because he wanted to show something in the life and ministry and teaching of Jesus that related to the world of his audience, of the people that he was trying to minister to. So the kind of experience that was happening here was probably not unknown to the people that John was writing to, the Gospel of John. They themselves had probably seen friends or relations that initially showed some kind of interest or type of faith in Jesus, but ultimately turned away under pressure from the synagogue authorities and the Roman authorities. And this was an example for these folk as they read and said, okay, how do you relate to this? So, what is going on here in the text itself? Well, he had done these things on the Sabbath. That's the reason they were persecuting Jesus, according to verse 16. But then Jesus says something that is extremely provocative. He says, my Father is working until now, and I am working. This sounds to us kind of like, oh, all right, my Father's working and I'm working and everybody works, don't they? Well, yes, but this phraseology, the way that Jesus is describing this, is that God is the one who constantly is still at work, upholding his creation. He made his world and he's still keeping it going. And this is why, verse 18, the Jews, by the way, that probably means the religious authorities in Judea, the temple authorities and Pharisees, were seeking to kill him, not only because he was breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, and now a very rabbinic kind of argument starts. And Jesus defends his work and his life and his ministry, and he says, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And then he says, greater works than these he will show him, so that you may marvel. There's an image in the background here that we miss. I don't know if you've ever been in the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Los Angeles. In the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Los Angeles, there's a wood carving. This man is I believe the artist was a true Christian. He's taught art sometimes at Christian seminaries, evangelical seminaries, but this wood carving is a fascinating piece of work. It's called Adoption. And it shows the carpenter stonemason Joseph with a hammer in his hand and the young child Jesus looking up at him. It's Joseph and Jesus. What Jesus is saying in this whole passage is that he is God's apprentice. For us, that's interesting. Most of us don't know what an apprentice is. We live and work in Germany, and so the apprentice system is still there. And when you see an apprentice, they're always working with one of the master crafts people. And what is going on here is that Jesus is saying, what my Father shows me how to do, I do. I'm doing the very same works that my Father does. Try to wrap your mind around that for just a second. What does it imply to say, I am the apprentice of God? What do apprentices become?
Well, what does God?
Yeah, that's the question. And we've talked about that in John chapter 1, about this whole issue of this complexity in God that even the Jewish people were wrestling with. So Jesus is saying he has a very unique relationship with the Father. In fact, later in the chapter, in verse 36, he says, the works the Father has given me to accomplish, these are the works that I'm doing. And they bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. That word accomplish is actually the word finish. The works that the Father has given me to finish, these works that I'm doing bear witness about me. We still have a little bit of a hangover of this meaning of this word in English when we talk about a finished carpenter. A finished carpenter is someone who puts the final touches on it, the one who makes it perfect, the one who installs the cabinets so that the kitchen is beautiful. This word that Jesus says here, the works the Father has given me to finish, these bear witness to me. Just a little asterisk for later, much later in the gospel. Jesus' last cry on the cross in the Gospel of John is what? It is finished. It is the work that Jesus is finishing that the Father has given him. So this image that Jesus...
What's his consecration?
Yes. By consecration you mean he dedicated himself to it? And he had these conversations sometimes with the Father, like in the Garden of Gethsemane. Is there some other way to do this? You sense his humanity. And then he says, I'm willing to go through with this, to finish the work that you've given me. So, in the world of the rabbis, though, what Jesus was doing here was he was making a huge declaration about his own personal relationship with God. And I think it's probably a good time that we take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back. And when we come back, I'd like to look at the things that Jesus was claiming that he could do that were so provocative to the rabbis. So let's take 10 minutes. So when we were looking at the text earlier, we asked, what does the Father do? What are his works? And what does the Son do? What are his works? In a sense, that's kind of a trick question, because Jesus says, what the Father does, I do. But there is an interesting kind of twist in there that comes in. Starting with verse 19, it says, I only do what I see the Father doing, just like he probably learned how to be a carpenter stonemason, watching his earthly father, Joseph, in the shop, getting assignments from him, starting out with maybe a small chisel or something, and then learning how to do this. And he uses that image and he says, whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son, verse 20, and shows him all that he himself is doing. And then he talks about these works. And as you look at verse 21 and 22, there are two specific things that Jesus says that the Father does, and one of them he hands off directly to the Son, and the other they share. So what are the two things that he mentions that that the Son does and the Father does?
Just gives them life who will.
Life.
Yeah.
Yep. It says he raises the dead and gives them life. And then the second is in verse 22.
Yeah,
Judgment, right. So in traditional Jewish thinking, in the teaching of the rabbis, those two things are things that are entirely reserved for God. Only God can raise the dead and give them life. Jesus is talking here metaphorically. Jesus can describe literal physical death. We'll see that in John chapter 11. But it's clear here he's talking about spiritual death initially. But he's also implying that the end of the age, because he mentions the Son of Man. And in the book of Daniel it says when the Son of Man comes, then he gives life to those who are in the dust. Some rise to a resurrection of judgment and some to a resurrection of glory. But it says the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. So Jesus is claiming that something that was ascribed only to God, the giving of life and raising the dead, he himself has been authorized to do by the Father. And then secondly comes judgment. And he's passed this responsibility to the Son, and we'll come across that later as well. But if God has given Jesus the authority to raise the dead, and he claims that he has, then it's also clear that he's given him authority over lesser things. This is a typical rabbinic argument. Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees right now, the rabbis, the later rabbis, and their teachers. And this is a typical rabbinic argument. And the way that he replies to them, the way he answers them, he says, these are the biggest things that God does. He gives life, he raises the dead, and he judges. Those things have been given to the Son. If you acknowledge that, which Jesus claimed, then, and this is the implication, I have authority also to decide any questions about the Sabbath. If God has given me these things, the Sabbath is nothing compared to that. And of course, the Pharisees went absolutely bananas, because he was claiming authority over what was appropriate to do on the Sabbath on the basis of the fact that God the Father had given him authority to raise the dead. And in the Gospel of John, we're going to see in John chapter 11, he literally raises Lazarus from the dead. And he goes a step farther and he claims the prerogative of judgment. So in verse 24, we'll skip a little bit forward there, Jesus makes clear that he's talking here about the spiritual darkness and death that these people are in. And he says, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. And then verse 25, he says, the hour is coming, and in fact it's now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Those who are dead in their sin, John chapter 3, can hear, and those who listen, who hear, will live. It's interesting to compare this with the book of Revelation, where in the first 3 chapters, you recall that phrase, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Jesus is saying here, if you listen carefully, if you can hear, then you can believe. So, what we're faced with here is some really radical claims by Jesus of the authority that he was claiming not only over the Sabbath, but over much more than that. But kind of in the final thing I want to point out tonight, though, he goes on and explains in verse 28, "Don't marvel, the hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice," which makes it clear that he's been talking about spiritual death and life before. But now he's saying there is going to come a time when literally those who are in the tombs are going to hear his voice. But then in the last section from verse 30 to verse 47, Jesus attacks the very worldview of the Pharisees. Everything that they had built their belief system on, Jesus attacks. He says, first of all, he said, you're depending upon Moses. You claim to be disciples of Moses. You're following Torah, the law. You claim to be reading the scriptures. In Jewish thinking, that's darash. You read the scriptures. You literally speak the scriptures as you read them. Psalm 1, you know, where it says, when we meditate on scriptures. Does anybody have an Old Testament with them? Can you just read the first part of Psalm 1? It's the very introduction to the entire book of Psalms. Yeah, go ahead. You're closer. You're closer.
Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers.
Go on.
Okay. But whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night.
Okay, thank you. Meditates on his law day and night. That word is related to this word that I used, darash. It's who speaks his word day and night. The pupils of the rabbis, and in Jewish tradition, probably at the time of Jesus also, was you read out loud under your breath if you didn't want to bother someone else. But when you read out loud. And that's still a deep tradition in the rabbinic schools, is you read the scripture. And so he who actually, it can mean mumble, as you mumble the scriptures, as you read them, as you digest them, as you meditate on them. And Jesus said, you're doing this to the Pharisees. My goodness, you're doing this. And he doesn't say that's wrong. He said, you're darashing, the Jewish word midrash comes from that Jewish rabbinic interpretation. You're reading the scriptures, but you're not making the right conclusion. You're not drawing the conclusions you should be drawing from them. You search the scriptures, 39. You read, you study, you're meditating on the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, that Torah is the life-giving source. But they are bearing witness about me. And you fail to take the next step. You refuse to come to me that you may receive life. You may have life. And then, from verse 41 on, Jesus drives a stake in the heart of Phariseeism. I do not receive glory from people, but I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I've come in my Father's name, you don't receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive them. How can you believe? And this is a summary of the world view and the culture of the Pharisees. You receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God. Maybe you've seen a film that Barbara Streisand made called Yentl. If you haven't, it's a glorious film. You've got to see that film. It was made in the 1980s. Barbara Streisand portrays the daughter of a rabbi in a Russian Jewish village at the end of the 1800s or beginning of the 1900s. And her father teaches her Torah, the law, which is forbidden. But she becomes this amazing Torah student. But she can't go to Torah school. She's a woman. And she ends up, her father dies, and everybody says, okay, you've got to get married. And she disguises herself as a boy and goes to Torah school. It's an amazing story. It's worth seeing. But when you see that, not if, but when you see that movie, I'm sure you can pick it up on Netflix or somewhere, but it's called Yentl, Y-E-N-T-L.
It's free on YouTube.
On YouTube, okay, great. So there's a scene in there where she has disguised as a boy. She's gone to Torah school, and this argument is taking place among the students about a point of interpretation. Now, it's a classic scene in a Torah school, and the way it takes place is they're citing authorities. Rabbi Nathaniel said, but Rabbi Judah said about Rabbi Nathaniel, and Rabbi Ezra said about Rabbi Nathaniel, about what he said about Rabbi Judah, and you find this whole chain of authorities that are being quoted. It's kind of like what happens on modern universities with how often your articles get quoted. I don't know if you know this, there is actually a mechanism you can determine how many times your article or someone's article's been cited, and the more times your article's cited, the more important you are in your particular discipline. Well, this is what Jesus is attacking. He says, I don't receive glory from people. You receive glory from one another. You're happiest if everybody's quoting you, or you're able to show that your interpretation is correct. And Jesus says, that's the wrong approach. You shouldn't be focusing on what you're saying about each other. Boy, this cuts close, doesn't it? You stop for just a second, pause. Let's kind of fast forward to where we are. How many clicks are there? How often is the pastor's sermon been viewed on YouTube? This is getting kind of close to the bone if we're really honest with ourselves, isn't it? And Jesus says, how can you believe? Not just you don't believe, but how can you believe? How can faith happen if you're focused on receiving glory from one another and don't seek the glory that comes from the only God? Don't think I'll accuse you to the Father. Moses, whom you say you're depending upon, who's your teacher, whom you claim to be his disciples, he's going to be the one. His teaching, his Torah, his law is going to be your judge. And then Jesus says a remarkable thing in verses 46 and 47. You don't believe in me. That shows that you don't really believe Moses. He says, if you don't believe his writings, how can you believe my words? For if you believed Moses, you would believe me. Can you imagine how furious the rabbis were with him? You can just see these people cooking with anger at Jesus. Sorry?
With red eyes.
Yeah, I mean, they were seriously upset. They were first of all upset with the claims that he was making. He was making these incredibly radical statements about his authority, Jewish teaching at the time of Jesus didn't have a lot of speculation, philosophical speculation, in the sense of the idea of natures and persons and things like that the Greeks had later. They dealt mostly with the scriptures, and the question was, what does God do? There was some discussion in some of the teachings about the nature of God, but mostly it was, what does God do? Well, God has made the world. He sustains the world. He works in the world. He judges.
Everything.
Yeah, he's the one that sustains it.
That's all I have to
Yeah,
do.
yeah. Yeah, he sustains the world he's made. And so Jesus comes in and he makes these statements that are so radical in identifying him with the work of the Father that the rabbis they can't deal with it. And he makes it more and more and more clear throughout the Gospel of John. We're going to see it until finally at the end it becomes clear what's going on here. But I do want to mention with John chapter 5, beginning with John chapter 5 probably, we are kind of at ground zero for the beginning of understanding who Jesus really truly was. The introduction to the gospel says, the light that enlightens everyone came into the world. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, with God, was God. But this is the actual drama of what took place. When Jesus begins laying down these claims and making these statements, and frankly, I think the disciples were probably as astonished as the Pharisees. It was just, wow. But they approached it entirely differently. They approached it with faith rather than with defensiveness. So, here we are. Jesus has made some incredibly radical claims in his interaction here in Jerusalem. At this feast, we aren't sure which feast it was, in the period of time that he was having a public ministry, but he had this confrontation due to this healing. And this healing, this echoes all the way down to the trial of Jesus, of what he did, because he did it on the Sabbath. And for us, we think, oh yeah, Saturday. No, I'm sorry. It's much, much more than that. So.
Now, can we talk about that Saturday? I have a friend I just talked to today, and we were talking about that. He wants to do some stuff around his ranch, and that, Saturdays are there for me. But he won't, even if he's not there, and I can still do the work and make a little money. According to, I don't know what church he goes to. I think it's, anyways, according to him, even because we're connected in that if I'm making money, it's like him making money, and he can't make money because it's on Sabbath on Saturday. I go, dude,
So he's a member of a Christian group that celebrates Sabbath.
Now, is that Seventh-day Adventist?
That's one of them, but there are others as well, yeah.
So when I read this, I thought, okay, I'm going to screen share, just send the picture, send Leroy.
Yeah. Well, the key point here is, did Jesus have the authority to reinterpret Sabbath?
Has the authority in heaven?
On earth. And this is what he was claiming. He was saying, the Father's given me authority to raise the dead, to give life to the dead. I'm going to be the judge. Those things are final, they're divine. I can tell you what's okay to do on the Sabbath. And constantly Jesus was pushing them on this issue of the Sabbath.
Like with the donkey.
So often, Jesus, he respected Shabbat, but he said the Sabbath is made for human beings. They're not designed to be servants of the Sabbath. But that's a deep issue.
Now, are you
that
saying the
Jesus had.
Sabbath is there to serve the human, the person?
Sure, that's what Jesus said.
I like that.
Yeah, he said the Sabbath is for us, humans, we're not designed as servants of the Sabbath.
So the Sabbath is there to serve Leroy.
Well, yeah, and traditionally Christians have had discussions about how we can transform the idea of Sabbath, how we need to respect it. I mean, I'm old enough that I grew up with things closed on Sundays. And that was a reflection of Christians saying we need to respect the fact that God had a day that he told us we should recharge. Again, I don't think it meant sitting in church for 12 hours, but some of the Puritans thought that. But that's a different discussion. But yeah, good observation.
You know that question you asked in the beginning, do you want to be healed?
Yes.
I mean, Jesus could have come on Monday, Tuesday,
Right.
but he went on that day.
Yep.
And then it's almost like he showed the man up for who he was. It's like that inner reflection. Because he could have rationalized it. He was rationalizing it, right?
Yes.
So this wasn't truly for that man. He just made a spectacle of that man.
He obviously gifted the man with something amazing. And he gave the man a choice. He found him and he said, I want to warn you, you need to not sin again. Apparently his sin was wrapped up somehow with his 38 years of disability. I don't know if he got in a gang fight or what. We don't have no idea what happened. There's another report of Jesus healing a man born blind in John chapter 9. And it's made very clear in that passage that there was no sin involved. But in this case, Jesus focused on this man's spiritual and moral life, and he said, you need to not do this anymore. And the man chose to betray Jesus.
Because he could have said, I can't do this, this is the Sabbath. The man could have said that.
If he felt that way, he could have, but he was unwilling to accept responsibility and unwilling to follow Jesus. It's going to be interesting when we get to John chapter 9 to contrast the response of these two men. Both of them experienced miraculous healing from Jesus, but their responses are entirely different. And the man born blind in John 9 gets into a theological discussion with the rabbis. And he pretty much shows up the rabbis in that discussion with some very simple questions.
Now, it almost looks like what Peter did when he denied Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
It's a similar thing when the guy gets healed, then he gets around his buddies or he gets around some other influential people or people that might make him a little nervous or something, and then boom, no, it's this guy.
Yeah.
Don't look at me, look over here.
Yeah, the whole story of Peter and his betrayal we'll get to at the end, but yeah, it's interesting comparison. Never thought of that. So, good. Okay, as my friends from south of here would say, y'all have a good week. And we'll see you again next week. We aren't going to do our third hour today. Drew sends his apologies, by the way. He's the guy that's doing the doctoral work down at BSU in material science, and he had to present some of his stuff to one of his supervisors tonight. So he's going to catch up online and sent his apologies. But good. Okay.
Just to clarify, this said 6:30 to 9:30. So I was prepared and I bought a little chocolate.
Very good. Yeah, I think I have one of the things explaining. The third hour is for those who are taking the course for credit, and we're discussing a book. However, since nobody's here right now who's taking it for credit, you're welcome to come when we have those third hours. Probably next week we'll do the third hour. But we'll take.
We're doing more of a class pass, and this is just a.
Yeah, this course is also available through the Biblical Studies Center down by BSU, and it's available for credit with Oklahoma Christian University. And so there's a couple people doing coursework that way. And so that's what the third hour is about.
But it's still cool that somebody like me can come off the street.
Please, yeah, I mean, yeah, I came off the street too, so. Okay, have a great week, and God bless. So.